I wasn't looking for proof of a hidden civilization when I started documenting old world architecture. I was cataloging construction techniques, measuring stone blocks, analyzing mortar composition, dating building materials. Standard architectural research, the kind of work that generates footnotes in academic journals and gets filed away in university archives. But then I started noticing the windows. Not the grand facades everyone photographs, the ones tourists admire and historians analyze. The other windows, the sealed ones, the bricked-over openings on second floors, third floors, sometimes fourth and fifth floors of buildings that officially shouldn't have that many stories. Buildings whose ground floors sit half-buried, whose main entrances require you to descend steps to reach them, whose windows start at heights that make no functional sense unless something changed. Unless these buildings weren't always at this level. The pattern repeats with disturbing consistency across continents. Courthouses in America with sealed windows 7 feet below current street level. Government buildings in Europe with ornate architectural details disappearing into the ground. Churches across Russia with lower floors completely buried, their basement windows now hidden beneath soil and pavement. And always the same explanation. Ground level rose, naturally over centuries. Sediment accumulation, urban development, flooding deposits. Reasonable explanations individually plausible until you realize that they're describing 10, 15, sometimes 20 feet of uniform earth accumulation happening simultaneously across thousands of cities worldwide in the span of maybe 150 years. That's not natural sediment, that's burial. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. I started photographing these buildings systematically. Buildings with 3 visible floors above ground and evidence of 2 more below. Structures whose architectural proportions only make sense if you account for the buried sections. Entrances that once sat at street level now requiring stairs downward. Windows that should illuminate first-floor rooms now opening into basements. And most telling, the architectural details that continue below ground, the same craftsmanship, the same design elements, the same quality of construction extending into sections that supposedly were never meant to be seen. Why would builders invest in ornate stonework for basement walls? Why would they install full-sized windows in sections meant to be underground? Why does the architecture make sense only when you add back the buried floors? The official timeline doesn't work. We're told these cities developed gradually, that streets rose naturally through centuries of development. But the photographs tell a different story. Images from the 1800s show these same buildings already partially buried. Photographs from the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, before the supposed urban development, before the modern infrastructure, already showing structures with ground floors, half submerged, already showing sealed windows, already showing buildings at the wrong elevation. These weren't gradually buried through centuries of development. They were already buried when the photographs were taken, which means something happened before the photographic record, something that displaced enough earth to bury massive stone structures across the entire world in a relatively short period of time. Let me show you what I mean. San Francisco, 1860s. Photographs show entire city blocks with basement windows at street level, with main floors accessed by stairs leading upward, with buildings clearly designed for a different elevation. But here's the thing. San Francisco was barely established in the 1840s. We're told it was built during the gold rush. constructed rapidly by settlers who just arrived. Yet the photographs from 20 years later show buildings that look centuries old, show structures already partially buried, show architectural sophistication that doesn't match the timeline of a frontier settlement. The same pattern appears in Seattle. Official history claims the city was rebuilt after the Great Fire of 1889, that the current street level was raised deliberately to prevent flooding. But photographs before the fire show buildings already buried, show the same sealed windows, show the same descended entrances. The fire didn't create the problem. The fire gave them an excuse to acknowledge it. And it's not just America. Photographs of Moscow from the 1860s show the Kremlin walls with lower sections buried. Images of Paris show Haussmann's renovation, revealing buried structures beneath the medieval city. London has entire tunnels and chambers no one can explain. Rooms built with the same quality as surface structures. Spaces that supposedly were always meant to be basements, but contain architectural details that suggest otherwise. What event could bury cities globally? What process could deposit enough material to submerge stone buildings across every continent in the same historical period? The official explanations fragment under examination. They say sediment. But sediment doesn't accumulate uniformly. They say flooding. But flood deposits don't bury granite foundations. They say urban development. But that doesn't explain why the buried sections show evidence of sophisticated architecture, why they contain finished walls, proper windows, decorated facades, all supposedly built to be underground. Unless they weren't built to be underground, unless these sections were street level, were functional, were occupied, until something covered them. I keep finding old maps. Not ancient maps, not medieval speculation. Maps from the 1700s and early 1800s. Cartographic documents produced with surveying precision, showing cities at different elevations than they exist today. Maps showing waterways that no longer flow at the same levels. Maps showing terrain that doesn't match the current landscape. And before you suggest map-making error, these weren't crude sketches. These were official documents produced by government agencies used for navigation and planning, drawn by professional surveyors who had every reason to be accurate. Something changed the landscape between when those maps were drawn and when the photographs were taken. Something massive, something global. And then there's the mud. Photographs from the 1800s repeatedly show cities in states of excavation. Not archaeological digs, not construction sites, active removal of earth from around buildings. Images show workers digging out structures, removing mud and soil from windows, clearing debris from foundations. Hundreds of photographs across dozens of cities, all showing the same thing. Buildings being uncovered, not being constructed, being excavated from surrounding earth. Why, what were they digging out, and where did all that material come from? The most common photographs show horse-drawn carts removing mud. Endless photographs of mud removal across America, across Europe, across Russia. Photographs from different decades, different cities, different continents, all showing the same activity. Removing earth from around buildings that were supposedly built at current street level, but are somehow buried anyway. Official history doesn't explain this. Urban development doesn't require excavating buildings you just constructed. Sediment accumulation doesn't bury structures fast enough to require immediate removal, unless something catastrophic deposited it. The photographs show a civilization in recovery, not in development. show cities being uncovered, not being built. Here's what disturbs me most: the basements. Every major city has them. Extensive underground networks, some mapped, many not. Tunnels connecting buildings, chambers beneath streets, entire underground complexes that supposedly were always meant to be basements, except they weren't built like basements. They have windows. They have architectural ornamentation. They have finished walls, proper doorways, features that make sense for occupied space but not for underground storage. Seattle has entire buried city blocks beneath the current streets. They call it the underground tour. Treat it like a historical curiosity. Explain it as old storefronts from before the street level was raised. But walk through those spaces. Look at the architecture. These weren't temporary structures. These were permanent buildings, built with the same quality as anything above ground, built to last centuries, built to be seen and used and occupied. Why would you build something that's sophisticated, that permanent, that well-crafted, and then deliberately bury it? You wouldn't. Unless you didn't bury it, unless something else did. Rome has the same thing. Layers upon layers beneath the modern city, they explain it as centuries of development, building upon ruins, the natural accumulation of urban civilization. But the layers don't work chronologically. You find advanced architecture beneath primitive construction. You find sophisticated stonework buried under crude masonry. You find evidence of knowledge and capability in the lower levels that supposedly predates the knowledge required to create it. The timeline is backward. The deeper you go, the more advanced it gets. That's not development, that's regression. That's inheriting something you can't replicate and building on top of it anyway, building cruder, building simpler, building with less understanding, because you're working from ruins, not from knowledge. And the most unsettling part? The buried buildings often show no signs of decay appropriate to their supposed age. Stone that should be weathered appears pristine. Mortar that should have crumbled remains solid. Architectural details that should have eroded over centuries look like they were carved recently, as if they weren't buried gradually, as if they were buried suddenly, protected from weathering, preserved in earth until someone dug them out. What preserves stone like that? What event buries architecture so quickly that it doesn't have time to weather? I have questions that accumulate, that build upon each other, that create weight the official narrative can't support. Why are buildings buried globally? Why do photographs show excavation, not construction? Why do basements contain architectural features meant for occupied space? Why do the timelines collapse when you compare maps to photographs to building evidence? Why does everyone accept that cities just naturally buried themselves, that streets just naturally rose, that stone structures just naturally ended up half submerged across the entire world in the same brief historical period? The buildings remember even if we've forgotten. The sealed windows preserve what the textbooks ignore. The buried floors wait beneath our feet, holding evidence we've agreed not to examine. Not because it's not there, because examining it requires accepting that something happened. Something recent, something global, something that changed the landscape so dramatically we built our modern cities on top of its remains and pretended the old world was always underground. What event could do that? What force could bury civilization globally? And why has every institution agreed, without coordination, without discussion, to simply not ask? The earth holds the answer. We just have to be willing to dig.